Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I am looking at US politics, interpretations and debates of the US presidency. This video is part of my playlist on US politics and also my bigger playlist on A-level politics in general, in which I'm aiming to cover the entirety of the A-level spec as I teach it. Now, this video builds on a lot of the stuff that I've been looking at in my earlier videos on the presidency, and it kind of gives a bit more of that analysis bit. A lot that I think is probably the most likely stuff that's going to be connected in the type of questions that you might get asked on the presidency in the US. In terms of specification, we are in 3.4, interpretations and debates of the US presidency, how effectively they achieve their aims, imperial presidency, the extent of presidential accountability to Congress, the role and power of the president in foreign policy. Now you need to do all of this with reference to presidents since 1992, and so this video will include quite a lot of details and quite a lot of examples going all the way back through Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and some little bits on Biden. Obviously Biden's only just come into office, so it's difficult to get much from that. Now, the first bit asks how effectively they have achieved their aims, and one of the first things I would direct you to is another video I've made on US politics, limitations on presidential power and why this varies between presidents, and that deals with a lot of the stuff in this. Now, there are some key bits on why they're effectively how effectively they achieve their aims changes. So one of the big bits to say really in defense, I think, of all presidents is that the Constitution deliberately makes it hard, given the extensive checks and balances that are placed on the president, for the president to really just do what they want. So therefore, all presidents' goals have to be compromised to an extent. And therefore, when we look, I'm going to put some stuff up as we go through the video, and we're going to go, well, what are the successes and failures of different presidents? Well, some of that's quite hard, actually, in a way, because particularly if they've faced a divided government, which is pretty much the case most of the time in modern American politics, then there has to be a degree of compromise. That compromise is difficult because American politics have become even more and more partisan over the last 20 years, probably reaching its absolute height in the Trump years. The presidents are generally more likely to achieve their aims in foreign policy, and we'll look at foreign policy in more detail later in the video. And there is this question of whether there's been this idea of an imperial presidency, where essentially the president has found ways around all these constitutional constraints that are in place, all these constraints by Congress that I've looked at in previous videos, these constraints by the Supreme Court that I've looked at in previous videos, and actually there is this imperial thing where they can bypass all of that. And again, more of that a bit later in the video. The next stage, I'm going to go through the most recent presidents. I'm not going to do Biden because as I'm making this video, he's only been in power for a matter of weeks. So I'm going to go back, and it says since '92. So I'm going to go back to Clinton. Now, Clinton was a moderate Democrat, and theoretically this should have made it easier for him to work with the Republicans. This isn't always the case. He did oversee a really strong economic performance by America in the 1990s, and this helped with some of his policy areas. So some areas which are generally considered to have been a success for Clinton was reducing the budget deficit and kind of restoring balance to the federal budget. And again, this was helped by the fact that the economy was doing really well at the time. There is the counterclaim. You could say that a lot of this goes down to Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House, and the Republican House behind him, and their contract with America, and therefore they constrained Clinton. So it happened in Clinton's time in office, but whether it's completely down to him, it is something for debate. There is some success on gun control, which is another area. Clinton pushed on it, notably the Brady Bill. And this led to background checks and waiting periods for gun purchases. It's not solved the problems, obviously, but it did make things tighter. It did tighten up those restrictions on guns to an extent, and within the constraints of what can be achieved given the Constitution. Key areas of failure. He was keen to push health reform, but he was unable to get major reform through Congress. And this, even when it was Democrat controlled, he failed to get this through Congress. In foreign policy, we can see him being constrained. He took action in Bosnia, including airstrikes, but he had to do this through executive order because he couldn't get backing in Congress. And also Congress forced to withdraw from American troops from Somalia. And so he tried to set this kind of idea of America's new role after the Cold War, and this kind of moral stance, standing aside, stop preventing genocide and bad treatment of people around the world. And he struggled with it to an extent. So that's some of the kind of highs and lows for Clinton. For George W. Bush, now we've got a guy here who kind of coined himself as a compassionate conservative, again aiming very much for the centre ground in 2000. He has obviously quite a difficult position in terms of mandate to start off with, because he loses the popular vote, and actually his electoral victory ends up in the Supreme Court, though he comes through as the winner. Now, in terms of success, one of the major things that I've talked about in previous videos is Bush gets a huge boost from his handling of 9/11 and the aftermath, and so successes can be seen, for example, his war on terror, where he actually extends the executive with the creation of the Homeland Security Department. He passes the Patriot Act, which enhances powers for counter-terrorism, and this gives some quite extensive powers to the executive branch and to the president. He's also seen as being successful with some fairly major tax cuts, again coming off the back of the economic success under Clinton. These were mainly for the wealthy, and they did require actually Cheney to break the tie in the Senate to get these through. Cheney was his vice president. Another success was in education policy with the No Child Left Behind Act, and this set federal standards, imposed a high degree of federal intervention in the education system. Again, this is a key part of his compassionate conservatism, and can be seen as a major success in terms of some of the changes and interventions it brought, particularly in the poorer inner city areas. A real area of failure for Bush was in social security reform, including an idea to privatise social insurance for the elderly, which was blocked in Congress by a combination of Democrats and Republicans. Now, one of the difficult things with Bush in terms of assessing his presidency is there is a big difference from the early stages and middle and the end. So the war on terror, which can be seen as a great success at the beginning, is not his wars are not a great success by the end, and post 2006 we really see Bush's presidency facing major blocks from a very partisan Democrat Congress, particularly in the House, and so it really is a story of two parts with Bush, where there's a lot of success early on, but actually if you concentrate on the bit from 2006 through to 2008, then we have a kind of protracted period of Bush looking very much as a lame duck. Next president is Obama, and Obama comes in 2008 and it is seen as this great new hope for America. He promised a degree of kind of progressive policies, particularly on health and insurance, health and immigration, and this ideal of making America a more inclusive and united place. And he had some successes. He's arguably only partial in this first one on the Affordable Care Act, which he did pass. It was a move towards health insurance for all. It has been hugely controversial. But it is something that we've seen being reinforced again in the early days of Biden. He fell short of creating a federal health insurance company to make sure that it was in place for absolutely everybody, and so he had to compromise to a degree. But again, that goes back to earlier things I said, where there are constraints in terms of how much power a president has. Another area of success is often judged to be his stimulus package, the $787 billion stimulus package to counter the 2008 financial crisis. And he passed that through Congress, and that was seen as a major success. A failure, albeit a partial one, was done on immigration reform. He wanted to give people more routes into US citizenship, particularly undocumented migrants and illegal migrants who had been in the US for long periods of time. He couldn't get this through Congress effectively, so he achieved some of it through executive orders. The difficulty, obviously, if you're doing executive orders, it's not binding on the next president. So a lot of this stuff, the progress that was made on this, was then rolled back on by Trump. And I think we're going to see quite a bit of it rolled back in by Biden. So it didn't work in the longer term, and it didn't work in terms of getting things through Congress, but he did manage to make changes in the short term through executive orders. Another area of failure is on Guantanamo Bay, the detention center there. Now, Obama said he was going to shut it, and he never fully closed it down. I mean, there's a dramatic change. It had 242 detainees at the start of his term in office, and it only had 41 by the end. And 197 had been transferred, repatriated, or resettled. So there is a degree of success in there, but he hasn't done exactly what he said he was going to do. Now, the Trump one is quite difficult in terms of it, because you will see hugely varying interpretations on him depending on which media outlet and commentators you are looking at. Now, Trump came in as the outsider candidate who claimed he would shake up the establishment and drain the swamp. He made some kind of really bold statements about what he was going to do. Now, there are some successes, and notably a massive tax cuts and reform, which benefited the well-off and the corporations mainly, and it did help the stock market as well. There is, so again, the First Steps Act of 2018, which moved towards some criminal justice reform, which is unusual in this time period. That actually received some bipartisan support. But a lot of his really big kind of attention-grabbing statements, although he would dispute this, have been failures. He claimed he was going to build the wall, as in build a wall on the border with Mexico, and he was going to make Mexico pay for it. Now, Mexico has not had to pay for it, though. Some of the wall has been built. He's done this without financial support from Congress directly. He's done it through other means, and but the money has come from the American taxpayers. So it's not. It isn't complete. He hasn't done what he said he was going to do, and it's generally fairly unimpressive in terms of what has been done. Obviously, the big thing is the whole MAGA thing with "Make America Great Again." Well, part of this, and we have to put the caveat on this. Well, there has been a global pandemic, but part of this we have to look at the unemployment, poverty, food stamps, all measures of the economy having gone horribly badly wrong are all at record highs by the end of Trump's term in office. America hasn't been made great in terms of its reputation across the world. This has been quite badly damaged by Trump's interaction, particularly with a lot of of America's traditional allies. There's been a trade war with China, which hasn't really brought US produces a huge amount of benefit, and so the great Make America Great Again thing has not really been a success. It's failed, and also it's the reputation of that as a movement, I think, has been damaged enormously by things like the attack on the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. And that links in with the final point in the Trump portrayed himself very much as reclaiming government for the people and all the people, and America has just become more and more divided during Trump's term in office. And we can look at Charlottesville, we can look at the killing of George Floyd, his murder. We can look at the attack on the Capitol on the 6th of January. We can look at all of Trump's rhetoric and false claims that have fueled the growth of the radical and extreme right, and all the conspiracy theories and stuff that have been spread and not really quashed by Trump when he was in office. And so again, that element of his presidency has undoubtedly failed. Now, one of the bits it's also really damaged is damaged the trust in the American political system and in the presidency, where we've had all these false claims being made. Now, one of the theories to look at in terms of the presidency, and leading to one of the big debates about the presidency, is this idea of an imperial presidency. And this is the idea that the president stretches the constitution to beyond where it should be and ignores, so they can ignore the wishes of Congress and kind of flex their executive power muscle, really. And the idea of the imperial president is this idea of this super powerful president who can really do what they want. It was first used by Schlesinger in '73 as an attack on Nixon, and the idea that Nixon was trying to take the power of the presidency beyond where it should be, and suggesting that the presidency developed a range of methods to kind of get around the Constitution. Now, we have seen this to an extent, and although this kind of was largely kind of relating to earlier presidency, kind of ending with Nixon, really, and so a lot of the presidency had gone before that, decided to become imperial. The power of the president had become kind of all-encompassing. We do see elements of it today. One of the big bits of this is executive orders. So these are instructions to the executive branch to either act or stop acting in a particular way, to do particular things, and it avoids taking things through Congress. We've seen, for example, just before I made this video, Biden had signed an executive order to reopen enrolment into the Affordable Care Act, making it easier also making it easier for people to access Medicaid, and that's something that Trump had stopped through executive order. Now, this is a power that really shouldn't be used other than to reinforce already existing laws. Now, we've seen a lot of things in the early days of Biden which have basically been a turning over of a load of the executive orders that have been done by Trump, and this would feed into, or give you examples to show, the idea of an imperial presidency, where Trump is acted outside Congress and then Biden is acted outside Congress. And there is concern amongst some political commentators in the States, well, you're likely to get this violent flipping and flopping one way and then the other as you swap between Democrat and Republican presidents every 4 or 8 years. There's been some kickback on these ideas. So we've got the actions over DAPA and DACA, which are to do with undocumented and illegal immigrants that were undocumented and illegal immigrants were done by Obama. We also saw Trump taking executive orders over immigration, and both of those were stopped by the courts. So there is this idea of the imperial presidency, with the president just acting without Congress, but it must be noted that actually some more recent attempts at doing that have fallen foul of the courts. Now, another method we get is signing a statement. So a president will sign a bill, but they might not be 100% happy with it, and so they might sign a statement, and in that they might say, well, some of this I'm not going to enforce, and one of the reasons they might give is they might say they believe it to be unconstitutional. So is this effectively the president giving themselves a line veto? Well, if you go back in the time in imperial presidency, it kind of looked like it might do, but if we kind of go into the more modern period, then in 1998 we get the Clinton v. New York judgment, and that says that the president must accept or reject a whole bill, and it therefore kind of squashing this idea that a president has a line veto. And again, there's something Trump would very much have liked with things like recent Defense Act, but it hasn't stopped the practice altogether. So Obama signed the statement, saying that he would not inform Congress of moving people out of Guantanamo Bay within 30 days. He was given the power to kill American citizens by drone strike, and he said he wouldn't do that, even though he had the power to do it. So these statements have kept on going despite the Clinton v. New York judgment. But because of that judgment, they have very, very limited strength. Now, Trump signed a statement accompanying the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, but this was just really because he wanted to show his disapproval of it, and he said it was impinging on executive power. I mean, I think a lot of it was impinging on his ego and how he wanted to act. Now, the other kind of key bits on this, and executive agreements are very much something we've looked at earlier, but these are agreements with other countries. And so this is a way around, rather than getting a way around having to get acts through Congress, this is a way around having to get treaties through the Senate. So Obama used this with Iran in 2015, lifting some of the trade embargoes and reaching an agreement with China over the environment. Now, one of the key bits with executive agreements is their agreement with that president. They aren't an agreement with the US government. So it can just be swapped over by the next president who comes in. So, for example, Trump had used executive orders and executive agreements, for example, on elements of foreign policy, such as Trump left the Paris Climate Agreement, Biden came in, signed and rejoined. So it is something that can be used, but it can only be used within the term of the president. So it doesn't have quite the same strength as getting a treaty and getting it through Congress. There's also this idea of unilateral war powers. This is that the president, as commander-in-chief, can take military action without consulting Congress. It has been used very commonly since World War II. It does seem to bypass the constitutional requirement. So again, this would be an idea of the Imperial Presidency. And the Imperial Presidency is seen most powerfully in foreign policy. So we saw, for example, in 2011, Obama ordered airstrikes on Libya without consulting Congress. However, this power only works for short actions. Anything that involves a more prolonged campaign, then the president can't really act without Congress, particularly as Congress holds the purse strings. So something like a limited number of airstrikes it'll work for, and kind of a prolonged occupation of a country, it's not going to. Now, the flip side of the Imperial Presidency is what's known as the Imperiled Presidency, which is the idea that the presidency is really under threat. Not only is it restricted, and we see a lot of that, how much it's restricted by the Constitution and by Congress and by the Supreme Court, but actually essentially it's the president is holder of a weak position, and they don't really have the power to get things done. And this was put forward about an idea about Gerald Ford and other presidents at that time, and it kind of looked at Carter and Ford, and it looked like presidents were becoming kind of weak. And part of it is the executive branch has just become so big and difficult to tame, and it's so complex that no president had the faintest hope of controlling it. Departments and agency and key staff all could slow down or block a president's wishes. They had no way of enforcing their will on these different parts of the executive branch. It's also most commonly used, the Imperial Presidency, to refer to the idea of Congress blocking a president's every move. And this, although it goes back to the times of Ford and Carter, this can now be used very much with our more recent presidents. So when you have a partisan Republican-controlled Congress, it wouldn't work and wouldn't compromise with Obama. And in his second term, we saw a huge amount of frustration for Obama as he couldn't get on with his program. And then with Trump, we saw it from 2018 with the Democrat-controlled House that worked actively against Trump from 2018 and just blocked his actions. So we can see that as the idea of an Imperial Presidency, and that's why there was such a fuss in 2020 going into 21 about what was going to happen with Georgia and those final couple of seats in the Senate, and therefore the impact that was going to have on Biden's ability to get stuff done. Now, it is possible to link Imperial and Imperiled, because if a president is imperiled in that they can't work through Congress is just blocking them all the way, and we've seen shutdowns, and we've seen bills being vetoed, and we've seen overriding of vetoes, and all that kind of stuff. then what that tends to do is push a president towards some of the stuff that talks about in terms of imperial presidency. So they can't work through Congress, so they try and go round it, and then Congress will fight back, and it will use particularly the power of the person restricting your budgets and or even refusing to pass them to kind of block the president off. So we get a mixture of it, I think, in the modern day, where the presidency is imperiled, but it is often trying to work in an imperial way. One of the other theories that is talked about in terms of this is kind of post-imperial presidency, and this is often seen by emphasised by the time in office of Reagan, where after the likes of Ford, we now are seeing kind of the restoration of the power of the presidency. And we see it domestically with Reaganomics and kind of the president really driving economic policy, and with the strong stand at the end, towards the end of the Cold War, with him describing the USSR as an evil empire and taking full control in foreign policy. Again, with this, we could see Clinton following on to it and being successful economically, but again, in the damage to the standing of the presidency because of the Monica Lewinsky affair. With Bush, you could argue that there had been a return to the imperial presidency, but all that stops in 2006, and he becomes very much imperiled. Obama seems to start off again imperial and put massive success pushing stuff through, but then becomes imperiled as the Republicans reclaim the House in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. So the circumstances and the numbers in Congress again starts to become really, really important. And this leads into this bit, the extent of the presidential accountability to Congress. Now, I recommend, again, for this in more detail, you go and have a look at my President and Congress video, and there's a link to it on the screen there. And again, you can find that through my channel. Now, Congress has some really key powers to use against the president. They can vote against the president's bill. They cannot schedule the president's program, so they might not even talk about the stuff that they want he or she wants them to talk about. They can override the president's veto. Congress, both houses, can hold committee hearings to investigate the actions of presidents and any part of the executive relating to that particular committee. The Senate can block executive appointments, they can block judicial appointments, and they can block treaties. And of course, and we've seen this twice under Trump, they can impeach the president and other members of the executive. So in its toolkit of weapons against the president, the Congress has quite a big set of them. And again, one you could add to that is the power of the purse. They control the money. Without the money, it's quite difficult for a president to do anything. So the accountability to Congress is really quite high, unless you use those imperial mechanisms and things that we talked about earlier, and you just try and go around them with executive orders and executive agreements and so on. But ultimately, if you don't work with Congress, you are not going to achieve all your policy aims. Foreign policy is traditionally the area where the president is at their most powerful. Now, the Constitution puts them in this position. So first of all, they are commander-in-chief. And this means they have huge amounts of military power. And as we've seen, they can act unilaterally, starting military interventions, which is hard to stop or pull out of once they've done them. So again, and we talked about some of that with other presidents a bit earlier on. As head of state and chief diplomat, it is the president who carries out foreign policy. So it's the president who makes treaties. He might then seek approval from the Senate afterwards. And again, a president working with Congress might have members of the Senate involved in the negotiations or key committees, talking to key committees about the treaties before he signs them. But generally speaking, it's an afterthought. It's done afterwards. And they can use executive agreements to avoid the Senate's role altogether. And again, it's difficult for Congress to act if they, on meeting another head of state, the president has said something, has presented America in a particular way, has shook hands on things. It's quite difficult then to be undone by the Senate. There are limits on this, however. Only Congress can declare war. Yes, I know they've been to it last done in 1941. There have been lots of wars since. There has been the 1973 Wars Power Act, and this is really quite significant. First of all, it was used to end US involvement in Vietnam. And it gives Congress the right to withdraw troops with a 60-day notification to the president. And this has been used to remove troops from Somalia in '94 when Clinton was in power. And the wording meant it's not always effective, however. So things like there are troops somewhere, then it can withdraw them. But when it comes to things like an airstrike, it can't really stop that. And we've seen the power of the purse. I mentioned that already. It can also reject treaties. A notable one in the time of Obama was not the Senate's greatest hour, I don't think, when they rejected the UN's Disability Rights Treaty of 2012. But again, it shows that the Senate has the power to do that. Now, in terms of political elements of this, the president has big advantages. So the president can claim that they are the person with a national mandate. So they're the only person voted for by the whole of America. So they can say that they're the only person who can represent the whole of America. And it puts them in a strong position to make decisions that affect the whole nation. Presidents expect and are expected to, by most Americans, to drive foreign policy. And when Congress is seen to overstep, it is generally roundly criticised for doing it. Quite a good example is Joan Bonnier, who invited the Israeli Prime Minister in 2015 to speak to a joint session of Congress about Iran. The Republicans essentially were trying to undermine Obama's policy towards Iran at the time, and this really was seen as an example of legislative overstep, where they're stepping on the president's toes. The stuff in terms of foreign relations was really down to the president, and Congress was making trouble. Having said that, Congress can claim a national mandate, and that is as strong, if not stronger, than the president's, particularly following a midterm. And they could therefore be claim to be acting on behalf of the American people. A big example of this, we've talked about the trouble Bush had towards the end of his term in office, is the Democrats kind of swept the board in 2006 midterms, and the war with Iraq was hugely unpopular, and they started drafting legislation calling for withdrawal. And so again, there we can see maybe a legitimate way there that Congress can step in on foreign policy and say, no, the will of the people isn't what you're doing. In practical terms, particularly with elements of modern warfare, the speed and effectiveness is a big thing, and the president is the person with his finger on the button or buttons, and the person who can get things done quickly. So it's not a case of, right, we're going to go to war, we're going to now spend 3 months getting everybody ready and then putting them on boats and things like that. The use of drones and fighter jets, nuclear missiles, cruise missiles, cyber hacks, decisions have to be made kind of really quickly. And that means practically that essentially the president does stuff and then might have to talk to Congress about it afterwards. The president is surrounded by specialists in EXOP, especially the National Security Council, particularly the National Security Advisor. So therefore the president is in the best place to make decisions. Even when they are consulted, then often Congress has to trust the president. And we see this in 2003. Bush claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and therefore he was sending troops in, and Congress kind of had to take his word for it. Where speed, however, isn't the key factor, the Senate in particular and Congress in general can play a greater role. The Senate Committee on Foreign Relations often has a great deal of experience. Notably, there was a period where it had both Biden and Kerry as key members of it. And the committees in the Senate and the House can hold closed sessions and therefore hear sensitive information. So it's not the case that the president can just say, well, I just can't tell you why I'm doing it, I've just got to do it. Then actually there are mechanisms where Congress can be given a degree of oversight. Some theories that have emerged with recent presidents. There is what is known as the Bush Doctrine, and this followed 2002, following the 9/11 attacks, and Bush talks about the threat from this axis of evil, and Bush, and again, depending on how much you believe in terms of who was in charge and who wasn't, and Dick Cheney, maybe it should be known as the Cheney Doctrine, launched this Bush Doctrine, and there's some really strong stuff in this. Essentially, they claimed that America was the world's superpower. It had primacy. It had defeated fascism. Lots of Europe might argue that they played a role in that as well. And they had defeated communism. Some might argue it just collapsed. And therefore, America offered the only sustainable model for success with freedom and democracy and capitalism. Therefore, this, according to the Bush Doctrine, gave America the right to preemptive wars to help impose this proven system on other countries for the benefit of mankind. Now, America has been involved in lots of great stuff, but again, one of the bits, some of the reaction against this was things I don't know if you've heard. It's a bit dated now, but there's a film with puppets in it, but lots of rude words, called Team America, a World Police, and this kind of is a bit of a send up of this idea. Now, when Obama replaced Bush, then we see a move to kind of more soft power. Obama's tone was very different, focusing on diplomacy rather than military strength. However, he failed to close Guantanamo Bay, which was one of his key aims in this. There were large offensives in Afghanistan in 2010 and 2011, and also a massive increase in the use of drone attacks. So it's not like there wasn't significant military action under Obama. He did withdraw troops from Iraq and set a date for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Trump has then gone on and has continued the idea of removing US troops wherever possible. But other than that, really, Trump's gone very much against the soft power ideas of Obama in terms of breaking international agreements, leaving treaties, leaving international organisations like WHO, criticising fellow members of NATO and stuff. Yeah, so Biden is likely, we think, to return to more the soft power ideas of Obama, which have largely been kind of pushed to one side by Trump. Again, I hope that has been helpful for you. If it has been, please hit like. If you've any questions or comments, then please leave them for me in the comments section. And if you haven't done already, and you're interested in US politics and UK politics and whole ranges of different types of history as well, then please do subscribe. I'm uploading lots and lots of different videos, building up my US politics bit, building up my UK politics bit, building up the various history ones. So if you turn on notifications, then you can find out all those different videos. Right, thank you very much for watching.